This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, journalist Loren Grush discusses her book, The Six, the untold story of America's first women astronauts. She details the history and experiences of the 6 women selected in 1978 to become America's first female astronauts. She's interviewed by former NASA Deputy Administrator Lori Garver.
It is wonderful to be here today with Loren Grush, a new author of a recently released book called The Six, the Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts. Loren, welcome. It's great to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you, too. I love our roles are reversed this time. Normally, I'm the one interviewing you.
That's right. I have been interviewed by you many times, so it will feel like, I'm sure, a wonderful conversation, but you're more comfortable asking the questions and I'm probably more comfortable answering them. But I'm really interested in this discussion because I have been involved in NASA, as have you, for a long time. I knew many of these original 6 women, all but Judy. And I just say right off, I have an advance copy here of the book. I really enjoyed reading this book. I have known some of the history, but the way it's been presented, I think people will find fascinating, and I'm interested in getting some of the backstory and the highlights teased out in this conversation. So I'll start right off by just asking you, and I could ask this a lot about a book I came out with last year. What motivated you to write this book? The timing, what is it that you felt the message was right to now get out about these women today?
Yeah, so my kind of go-to answer is, obviously I've been reporting on space for, nearly a decade now, and it's, the space reporting field, it's still a pretty male-dominated industry. Obviously, as I've continued in this profession, I've met a lot of great women journalists, and they're absolutely fantastic, and I find myself really drawn to them, and we kind of created this own little cohort within the space reporting world sometimes, and that's been really special to me. But it also kind of dictates, what stories I'm drawn to in space. Also the space industry is still quite male-dominated, and so it's always been very important to me to try and center women's voices in the space field as much as I can. And so that really kind of helped me look back. And, when I think about women in this industry, I kind of was drawn to the women who came first, who were the first female space reporters in this field, and then also who were the first women in the space industry. And that ultimately led me to this group of 6 women. And I think I was like probably most people in the public. I had known Sally Ride, obviously, because she was the first American woman in space, but I really didn't have much of a sense of who the other 5 women were. And when I learned more about them and just how easily it could have gone to, say, Judy Resnick or Anna Fisher or any of the other 6 women, I was, very fascinated by their stories, and a lot of what ifs kept popping into my head of thinking, what if it had been, somebody else? What if it hadn't been Sally? And how that would have changed the history books. And so, it really was a way for me to learn more about them as it was to tell their story to everyone else.
Yeah, that is a fascinating part of the book that I do want to dig into, because the selection of Sally to be first is something you, I think, reveal some things that have not been talked about before. Some of your sources, the person who has done astronaut selections, George Abbey, as you describe him well in the book, and I've known him well over the years, it's always been shrouded in mystery. So even every one of the 6 and how they're selected, you go into, and I want to be able to let you tell some of those stories. For me, I think it's also interesting because right now NASA has announced a woman is going to be the next among the next crew that will be 2 people to go to the moon and walk on the moon, and lots of people speculating about that selection. And I really think some of what you uncovered here can help reveal that. So we might dig into that if we have time.
Sorry. I was just going to say the selection process was really the most fascinating for me, because I think I had built it up in my head as at being this one way, and then revealing it was a whole different scenario.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. I think the group of women, as we get into each of them, the very last to fly of the 6, Shannon Lucid did, as you point out, end up being the astronaut of the 6 who stayed the longest at the agency, who flew by far the most flights and hours, doubling all the others combined. It's really a situation of the tortoise, slow and steady wins the race, because her first flight was after Sally's second flight. And if you think about the competitive environment of the astronauts, I've, as I said, gotten to know many of them, and Shannon was never one of those people. She was a mother when she was selected, and had a lot of other things going on, and didn't really play in the game of, I want to be first. And she had an amazing career. So starting with Shannon Lucid, I'd love to hear one of the vignettes. I think you interviewed her in person for your research. What can you tell us about Shannon that you uncovered that will be really a teaser for people who are going to read the book?
I think you really nailed it when you some of the things you just said about her. Shannon, among the 6 of them, probably yearned the most to be an astronaut. One of the things I loved learning about her was when the first Mercury 7 astronauts appeared on a magazine cover back in, the 60s. She immediately, it clicked for her. She saw all white men on that cover, and she thought, I'm completely excluded from this cohort, even though it was something she desperately wanted to do. And she even mailed in a letter to the editor to ask if they were going to let women into space someday. And she got a response from what she remembers saying, maybe someday. And then it ultimately turned out that she was one of the 6. But you're right, while she had this burning passion to go to space, she wasn't really caught up in the politics and the competition of being the first American woman, but she definitely, with all of the astronauts, and this went for the men as well in their class, they all wanted to fly as soon as possible. That is what I've been told. The aim of an astronaut is to go to space. And so having to wait is a pretty agonizing process. But, it wasn't important to her to be, this big name in the history books. It was really just that she got to go. And, everyone who talked about Shannon all described her the same way. It's just she was very cool, calm and collected. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that was reflected in her work. And she was also a woman of great integrity. There's a big story in the book about how, she was invited on this trip to Saudi Arabia, and there were some restrictions for her to go by herself because she was a woman, and she took a stand, and there was a moment where they said that she could go if she went as an honorary man, and she said, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. And I think that's very indicative of Shannon's scruples.
Truly, I had never heard that story, and it really, I think, showed of them all, she was also perhaps the greatest feminist in her own way, that she wasn't going to go on that trip. I, too, was invited to Saudi Arabia as the deputy administrator of NASA and didn't go because even by then it was not something I felt we should be supporting. And but she really stuck to that. I love that you revealed that story. Next in the line, the 5th to be assigned, was Dr. Rhea Seddon, another fascinating person who I believe you interviewed personally for this. Married to another astronaut, ultimately flew on 3 flights. The only one to sort of take makeup, I guess. Like, her personality is very different than Shannon's, but yet, wow. How driven could you be that she kept her medical? You outline their schedule, and I really feel like she, as a doctor, just I don't know how you can do astronaut training along with that.
That was one thing that really struck me about all of the women, is just how extremely busy they were and how much they juggled. I mean, it wasn't just Ray, others were doing postdoc work or, research at the same time. I can barely keep, my wits about me with the one job that I have. I can't imagine juggling, such heady jobs all the time, but they really managed it with grace. And another thing about Ray is she was the first to give birth to the so-called astrotot, which is a child born of 2 astronauts. And she really had her hands full with, a newborn, her doctor work or medical work, and then also being assigned to her first space flight. So that really inspired me about her. And, her flight is extremely interesting because, that's what I loved about diving into these stories, is learning each about the shuttle flights that they flew on. I feel like, we know about the shuttle flights, but we don't really dive into what exactly they did when they were up there. It kind of lost that momentum over time. So it was really great to kind of go in and learn more about the satellites that they were deploying and the payloads that they had on board. But Ray's is very interesting because it did not go according to plan, and they really had to improvise this makeshift mission while they were in space, and they did it with incredible ease, and it was a lot of fun for them, actually. So that was a particularly fun flight to write about.
Yeah, and I do remember that one because the SYNCOM didn't work after we deployed it, and I don't want too much of a spoiler alert because you describe it well, but struck by, while she's creating and having to stitch together literally a tool in space to use in real time, someone from NASA called her a good seamstress, and Sally Ride, who was on Capcom, made the correction of a surgeon.
Right.
I love that interplay.
And that was a great example of the women kind of like looking out for each other. They were an interesting team of folks. I wouldn't call them the best of friends, but when they were needed in a pinch, they always had each other's backs, which I really liked.
Yeah, I think the interaction was probably unique to your book, really interesting. You don't sugarcoat it and say, oh, they were all best friends, but in the moments of the story, it is clear there wasn't backstabbing in the sense of other than a competition to be first, I'm sure. But
yeah.
Your point, I want to pull on a bit about how much else they did. Do you get a sense that is the same for the men? The male astronauts? I really didn't know how much else these women were doing, and it does seem above and beyond what we typically see.
Mm-hmm. You mean the camaraderie between the men as well?
I'm saying, as you were noting how busy they were doing so many things and research and so forth. I don't know if it's a sign of the times, but today I think the astronaut corps is a bit smaller, and most of them have PhDs before they come. You know, they aren't doing the multitasking, I think, that these women did.
I think some of them did. I mean, there are other doctors and other researchers that continued their research, which to me blows my mind because, like you said, and the training alone was already so intense. They had to stay current in the T-38 jets that had to get 15 hours of flight time each month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's quite a lot when you're also, learning the ins and outs of the space shuttle, every component, every subsystem. That was something that they had to do. They were also taking science classes. And then they had their jobs, their technical assignments on top of that, which, sometimes was flight software, was working with pressure suits. There was quite a lot to do within training alone. So the idea that they had time for anything else was really mind-blowing.
Yeah. And next was Anna Fisher. And Anna Fisher gets, I believe, the first mother in space. Mm-hmm. And you and I both know that daughter, Kristen Fisher,
yes.
Both, two parents as astronauts. Kristen is a space reporter in part of your female space reporters group. Yes. But she was the fourth to be assigned, which is interesting as we get into the selection for the first. She had the chance potentially to be the first. Was, I think, probably the favorite of some. And she did get pregnant, and she knew that would take her out of circulation for a bit. But what else can you tell us about that you found out about Anna?
Well, Anna just was very determined, and I loved that about her. You know, she very much committed. She said, I'm going to space, and I knew that's what I was going to do, and nothing was going to detract me from that. And she knew that when she got assigned, especially after she had gotten pregnant, that, you know, there would be some criticism. And that part really struck me. I mean, obviously I wasn't surprised. I knew, you know, with every single one of these women, there was going to be some kind of friction with the choices they made because, you know, the country wasn't as far along, as enlightened as it needed to be by that point. But hers is really, you know, one of those double standards where you're just kind of icked out by it because, you know, before she flew, there was all this commotion about how she was going to be the first mom, and people were really not very happy about it. You know, there are a lot of questions about, you know, how could she leave her child behind, especially, which is just, you know, kind of egregious to think about when she's on a crew with other men who also had children, and none of them were asked, you know, how they felt about leaving their children behind. And even when she was in space, you know, a reporter asked how being an astronaut fit in with her duties as a mother, and she just had to be as graceful as possible. I mean, they all had to be as graceful as possible when they were asked questions like that, and she handled it really well. But one thing about Anna I thought was really interesting was that, you know, she never really took a formal maternity leave. She was assigned to her flight right before she gave birth, and then she was back in the office the next day with her little pillow seat, and she really wanted to show, you know, how determined and dedicated she was to her flight. You know, I'm sure people have different opinions about, you know, whether or not that was, you know, something she should have done or that she needed to do. Maybe that was like an infrastructure issue, or, you know, the fact that she still had to go into the office. But ultimately, that was her choice, and she really wanted to prove that she was just as dedicated to her job as she was to being a mom.
Yeah, that's right. You could see maybe NASA getting some criticism today, but for then, I was thinking as I was reading your overview of it that, well, good for NASA that they even assigned her as she was coming out of having a baby. And yes, that's not how we would look at it today, but you have to look at these things in the times. And Anna, I guess you didn't interview. She had a contractual obligation. Is she writing a book?
So, you know, the women are very popular in terms of their stories. There are other stories that they have been under contract for. So, but Anna was really great. You know, I attended lots of Q&As that she had done, and I even went to one of her Ask an Astronaut events at Kennedy Space Center, and that was a really, and also one of the things about these women is, you know, they've been telling their stories for years and years, and so they've been very open with, you know, what it was like for them and their feelings and their experiences. And so that it made writing this book really quite easy and quite fun because there's such a rich history to dive from already.
Yes, which does make it surprising to me there hasn't been this book written previously, because they are pretty open. Our next character is Kathy Sullivan, the third female American astronaut to go to space. She's written several books, and I know had also a contractual reason to not be interviewed personally, but she's talked about her experiences. I probably know her best of the six. I think a lot of us do, because she's had a long, illustrious career in not only NASA management, but NOAA management as an oceanographer and a geographer, and she just really, as a geologist, also has focused on a lot more broad than just space travel, going to the trenches of the ocean and so forth.
Right.
Hubble Space Telescope, two missions, play large in her NASA astronaut career. But interestingly, there is less written about her personal life. And I'll be interested in your Kathy story to share with us that you uncovered, but recognizing that couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, I think that might be by design.
Yes.
And I think that's also what I learned from writing this book is that some of the women are very eager to talk about their personal lives. For instance, Anna Fisher, her husband, Bill Fisher, he was also in the astronaut corps, very big part of her story and her overall career at NASA. So, for some, it's they're an open book. For others, not so much. And that was the same with Sally, too. I think it was only after that she passed, unfortunately, that we learned what we did about her personal life. So I think it's just, and it goes to show that among women, we're not all the same. We're all very different, and we all like to share certain things and not share others. But with Kathy, Kathy's story was really fantastic because it really got to dive into the world of spacewalks and, all of the contention surrounding, the first American woman to do a spacewalk and, was she going to have a different time? There's a story in there about whether she needed to spend more time doing a pre-breathe, which is, taking the time to reach the right pressure beforehand. And there was concern, that because she was a woman, she would have a different time and she had to fight back against that before she performed her spacewalk. And so, that one was really fun. And also, when she flew with Sally. And so hers was the first flight with 2 women on board. And I thought that was really interesting because, she made a comment about how, I think this was in one of her oral histories, when they were selecting the first woman, heaven forbid they select 2 of us to go for the first time. It had to be just one, but hers was ultimately the one where the first 2 women flew, which I thought was neat.
Yeah, that was the pre-breathe story. Everyone's going to have to read the book to get that one because that's a really good one, and I had not heard it. And I think Kathy is pretty open about some of the early shenanigans, antics of men when they flew. The famous "how many tampons do you pack" stories.
Yes, she's a very big figure in that.
Yes, but she really. I found later as a manager also, she had all that down and she knew what she was dealing with, which was really helpful for her career. I think, interestingly, she's also been open that she wasn't even at Sally's first flight. She's been the most open to say, it was a little hard not to be selected as the first.
And that for me is something that I can relate to. Obviously, I think at the time they probably all wanted to put on a very strong front and, say, oh, it doesn't bother me to be the first, or, I just want to fly. But I feel like, if I were one of the first 6, I think there would probably be a small desire, maybe not a small one, to be the one in the history books, And so for her to be open about that and that it actually did bother her, I think is something that we could all relate to. And I'm really happy that she did, make that known to people that, it did hurt to not be selected as the first.
I agree. Buzz Aldrin has also done the same, being number 2 on the moon. Well, the second woman selected for a NASA space mission was Judy Resnick, and hers is a tough story since we know she ultimately lost her life on her second flight in Challenger accident. A very vivacious person. We all can remember her floating in space with her beautiful hair taking up half of the shuttle capsule, it seemed. Lots of fun stories. What's your favorite, Judy?
I think learning about Judy was probably my favorite part of this book because it really did feel a bit like detective work, having to piece together people's memories of her from, the people that worked with her, what they remember of her, and everyone has a very vivid memory of Judy, and it was very much, she could take a lot of crap, but she would give it right back. And I really love that description of her because everybody kind of said it about her, and I really like that. She was obviously a very strong, very bold personality, and she was very committed to being taken seriously. She was fiercely protective of her private life, and also she did not want to make any kind of show about her gender. She also made history as the first Jewish American to fly into space, and she also didn't want, she didn't like labels. She just wanted to be an astronaut, and she didn't want to emphasize the other aspects of that. Not that she wasn't proud, but, it was just she wanted to be known for her job and her job alone. And I thought that was really inspiring. Her flight is also fantastic. They had the first pad abort, which, for me as a current space reporter, it was interesting to hear all the fuss around the pad abort because currently we have pad aborts all the time. It's when the rocket, fails to ignite the engines right away while it's on the launch pad. So those for me are pretty common. But back then, that was a very scary time for the shuttle program because they'd never had a pad abort before, and that scene is was really fun to write because it was a very vivid memory. It's one of those flashbulb moments for a lot of people. So those who were on board during that abort really remember it, and they remember every kind of second as it ticked by. And so that was really neat to get to write. It was almost as if I was there. And then when she did go into space, you mentioned her hair. There's really great moments that really showed how cognizant the women were that they were under this intense media scrutiny when they flew. Judy had an incident with her hair. I won't go into full detail, but she had to swear her crewmates to secrecy about it because she knew that if it got out, that would be the entire focus of her flight because she was just the second American woman to fly. And I think that's just a good reminder that when you do fly as a first in a underrepresented group, there's much more eyes on you than you could ever possibly want, and you're representing a larger cohort of people.
Yeah, I think you pull that out really well in the book. All six took that on in their own way, and that was probably a thing that bonded them. They knew. Yeah. They knew they each had to be excellent, and by all indications, they were all excellent. Yeah. Just truly remarkable missions as you go into them, and their success, their role in them, it just made me smile to turn every page. To go into now, Sally Ride, the first person selected. I'm interested in both your takeaways. First, before, as you say, you ended up being able to talk to her partner of 27 years, Tam O'Shaughnessy, as well as her husband, Steve Hawley. But before we knew of her personal life, her selection, to me, the story of George feeling, I think for a lot of the really substantive ways she was great at using the remote manipulating arm that would play in this mission, but really when he went up and pushed her as being the first to Chris Kraft, you say he said no. Yes. So he had two others in mind. I'm presuming that's Judy and Anna. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think since then Chris has mentioned Sally was not his first choice, and I think that is really what struck me about learning about this whole selection process, was how it really came down to one guy's opinion. I mean, he obviously had some help. I talked about how he consulted with Bob Crippen, who was the commander of that flight, but it really, George Abbey was the guy that got you to go into space, and he had this mythos about him, but also there was mystery, because he never told you where you stood. That was kind of the criticism I heard was, he was a very opaque person.
Yeah, it seemed like every time a woman was on, you thought they were going to be asked. They weren't sure if the call was to tell them they were out.
Right, yeah. Or if they were in trouble or something. No one quite knew what a call from George Abbey meant until you actually heard the words, we'd like to assign you to, so-and-so flight. But yeah, no, George, when I spoke to George, he really didn't, he thought it was interesting that people thought it was this big mystery, because for him there really wasn't any kind of special sauce to it. He really just tried to match people with the best qualifications to the requirements of the flight. And so for SDS-7, which was what Sally flew on, was very involved with the remote manipulator system, or the robotic arm. And at the time, she was really considered, the best at the robotic arm, manipulating it. And so that was ultimately what, the outward reason for why she was selected. But, there were other things about her, too, that did go into consideration, at least from what Bob told me. They thought she would be able to handle it, better than maybe some of the others. Just they didn't think that being the first was something that would go to her head, and that might have to do with the fact that she was a big compartmentalizer, and she was also a bit of an introvert, so that might have also played into her favor. So it really wasn't, while they say that it was her work with the robotic arm, there were other things at play as well. They also referenced her past as a tennis player, and how she was able to keep her cool on the tennis court. So I think some of those things played into it as well. But like I said, I was really surprised by it, because I think in my head, and maybe in most people's heads, we've built up astronaut selection. I thought maybe there was some special algorithm, you put all these inputs into a computer and it pops out, the perfect person for the job. And really, it can be just as subjective as any other selection process out there.
Yes, indeed. I think that comes out well. And I think the phrase you said, she would not, they felt, seek the spotlight or fame. And to me, that's really a fascinating thing when you look at other selections NASA's made for astronaut firsts. And certainly with Neil Armstrong, also an introvert, I would guess that played. And so maybe as we look to first people back on the moon here, we ought to be thinking of that. As I mentioned, at the time of her death in 2012, well, first we should say Sally flew twice on NASA shuttle missions. She was scheduled for a third before Challenger, and after the Challenger accident, stayed to be involved. She was the only astronaut assigned to be involved in the Challenger accident investigation. She played a pivotal role that you outlined well, and then went on to author a report known as the Ride Report, but was really about the future of the space program, laid out a lot of what we ended up doing to this day. Fast forward, she continued to play this role as I worked with her later.
I was just going to say, you also, she became known for helping out with the shuttle investigations. And then I know she also worked on a report after the Columbia disaster that you worked on with her as well, right?
Yes, indeed. We were thrilled, joy of my life, to work with Sally over the years, and the most recent was on the future of human spaceflight that really put us on the course we're on. I have said the commercial crew program that you cover and that I've been involved in has really, we wouldn't have it, I feel, without Dr. Sally Ride. She is someone who I saw her come to the opinion during what is known as the Augustine Committee, but the Future of Human Spaceflight Task Force in 2009. And she ultimately, with all her credibility, was able to say, it's time, and we can now transition our astronaut transportation to and from the space station to the private sector. Not part of the book, but you well lay out Sally's credibility and how she earned it and how important she's been, I think, not just to NASA, but to the nation. And then at her death, to find out that she had a female partner. You interviewed Tam. Tell us about that. I don't know that really much has been talked about since the New York Times obituary, which stated very matter-of-factly that she'd had a partner of 27 years who was a woman.
No, Tam was fantastic to speak to, and she also has many old, tapes that Sally, Sally used to record everything. She was very meticulous in taking notes and writing things down and recording things. And so Tam shared some of those materials with me, and it really made the book all that more vivid and great. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out Lynn Scher's book about Sally Ride. Tam is also featured heavily in there, and the Sally Ride biography is, by Lynn, is, really the definitive text about Sally, and she does a great job with that. But one thing I really loved talking to Tam about was, obviously they kept their relationship private while Sally was alive, but then, Tam essentially came out when Sally passed. And she told me, she knew that she probably got some criticism about keeping that a secret, but a lot of people have messaged her since, she came out and became public about it, and told her that, her saying that she was Sally's partner, gave them the confidence and courage to come out themselves and be true to who they were. And so I thought that was really a fantastic thing to learn. And I think, that's just, it shows how much weight Sally had while she was in this world. And even when she's not, she still inspires people to this day.
She absolutely does. And I agree. Lynn Shear's book, the biography of Sally, really is the penultimate work on her life, and she does go into more detail about these relationships and the timing. You cover it very well as well, and I'm struck by this question, which Lynn teases out a little bit. When did NASA know? Did people suspect? There's so much speculation. Did you pick up on any of this?
No, I really didn't. And just to be clear, Sally was also married, to Steve Hawley when she was, training to go to space and when she was in space. So, and Tam and I have talked about this too. She probably, was attracted to both men and women. So maybe there wasn't, there was no speculation happening at that time. I did talk to one of Sally's friends who mentioned that, she had heard a reporter was looking into Sally's sexuality, and that really bothered her when she heard about that, but ultimately nothing came of it. But I'm pretty sure, obviously we can't talk to Sally now, but I'm sure there was a concern for that to come out, because that would be, all anyone talked about was the fact that she had a past relationship with a woman before she came to the space program. And, there's a reference to Billie Jean King and how much scrutiny she was under when she came out. And obviously Billie Jean King was a role model for Sally as a fellow tennis player. And so, it was probably just one more thing that she had to think about that she probably shouldn't have had to think about at the time. And it's indicative of the fact that, when Sally flew, there was still quite a long ways to go in both, how the country viewed women and how the country viewed, gay people. And, she really took on a very big burden when she stepped into that role.
Yeah, that is a great point that I think those of us who knew Sally felt when she died. Of course, overwhelming grief. She wasn't even very open about her pancreatic cancer, although I had seen her fairly recently. It was obvious she wasn't well. But the head of NASA, Charlie Bolden, who'd known her a long time, when she died, asked me, "Did you know that she was gay or bi?" And I said, "No, but I wouldn't say it's that surprising." Of course, he knew Steve Hawley, her husband. No reason to have it really be questioned, except that she was private. So the very thing that she was selected for, almost, as we were talking about, one of the discriminators, also played into this. And it's interesting that for Sally, she didn't love, in all the interviews and all the crazy questions that you outlined journalists asked her, she kept hoping for a day when the issue wasn't the fact that she was a woman. She certainly wouldn't have wanted to add to that another aspect of her private life. So yeah. It's very understandable. But there's a visit that you discuss in the book where George Abbey, who had selected her, seemed to think Sally was a little nervous, not herself, before her first flight. And he brought in one of Sally's guests to the launch, and she was a former girlfriend of a romantic relationship of Sally's, and allowed her to go to the beach house, breaking quarantine, to settle Sally down. Sally was married at the time. It wasn't astronaut Steve Hawley, her husband, who he brought in. It was Molly. Hard to really imagine George didn't have a sense.
I mean, I'll leave the speculation to others, but from what he told me, he just knew that she was very close with Molly, and that if anyone could make her feel more comfortable, he wanted to provide that for her. And so I thought that was very sweet. He must have had some sixth sense of some kind.
Yeah. Knowing George as long as I have, he did that with a lot of people, so it could be anything. And broadening out now, we've got about 20 minutes to go. We have a more general discussion about women at NASA, specifically women astronauts at NASA. And you mentioned, I think in the epilogue, that in the years after the six left their mark on NASA and the world, the ranks of women in the astronaut corps continued to swell. You say later, maybe not as much as you should, they haven't really swelled. I'm just wondering how you chose that language, because there were 6 astronaut females in this class. We've only one other time had more than 6 in a class.
It's true.
Mostly for the next 20 years, there were only 2 or 3.
To be fair, though, this was one of the larger classes that we've had, I think, in a very long time. I'm not sure when we've had other, 35 people enter the astronaut corps. But you're right, and I did try to make that clear at the end. While we've had women in every single class since the 6 arrived, we're very, very far away from reaching parity of any kind. 1/6 of the people who've gone to space have been women, and so. It's still quite a ways to go. And then in terms of the statistics for women of color, it's abysmal. We are still trying, racing to catch up. And so I am inspired by NASA's Artemis program, which has the stated goal of sending the first woman and the first person of color to the moon. Obviously, I think there's, there might be some debate as to whether or not, that should be in NASA's goal for the program. But I think it's a great, it's a great way to move forward. And the fact that they are putting these things top of mind is nice. But, it's still, we have a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, I think any of the 6 probably wouldn't love, I know Sally wouldn't have them particularly in advance saying it'd be a woman. Again, she was yearning for a time when this would be behind us. Then we would have equity. And it is rather shocking that 45 years after the 6 were selected, there has been only one astronaut class that had gender equity. That was under my watch. I'm proud to say it was only 8 people, and we managed to get 4.
Of course it was, Lori.
But they haven't done it since, and the selection that was made just as I was arriving in 2009, I think was 3 women out of 12 or something. It's been, I've run the percentages, and we did have a class in 96. It was 44 people, so well over the 35, and there were 8 women. But that's a similar percentage to what we had 20 years before.
Yeah.
Just every photo of every class, every moniker of every class, the 8 balls, they're just all gendered terms, and I'm not sure why we can't get out of this. I am interested, I think you get into a little, the 35 new guys is what the class of the 6 was known as. Tell me about how they picked that and what that's really stands for.
Well, yeah, it's really the TFNGs was their name. For publicly, it was the 35 new guys because there were 35 of them. And also, I think, and I say this in the book as well, that term is really indicative of what the women wanted to be. At the time, they very much wanted to be just one of the guys. It was not in their nature to highlight themselves as women. They wanted to seamlessly fit in, and that that was seen in all of the choices that they made. There's a great moment in the book where Anna and Sally snuck away to a department store to go buy khakis and polo shirts, which was, the de facto uniform for engineers, which still is, by the way, at least based on my parents when they were working at NASA. But yeah, that was kind of how it was for women, especially for the first women back in, the 70s and the 80s. You really didn't want to highlight the fact that you were, a woman, or that you were a woman astronaut. You just wanted to be an astronaut. I think we've evolved a bit in terms of how we see, how we present those things today. Obviously we want to be treated equally. At least I know I do, but also am happy to celebrate the fact that I'm a woman. So I think they had to kind of try and fit in as much as possible in order for us to kind of celebrate those differences moving forward. But also the term TFNGs has a cheeky second name, which is the effing new guys, which is a military term to refer to the fact that they knew they were the newbies, and that, everyone was looking at them with a side eye.
Yeah, absolutely. Do tell us about your background. I hadn't noted that your parents worked at NASA.
Yes.
So what did they do?
Yeah. So, this is why I really loved writing about the shuttle program, was because it's been near and dear to my heart for my entire life. My parents worked their entire careers on the space shuttle program. My mother was the deputy orbiter chief engineer, and then my dad helmed the propulsion branch at JSC before they retired. And so, I really grew up with the space shuttle program. Obviously, on the engineering side, it's very different. I learned this, the engineering portion versus the operations, they're very separated. So this was a chance for me to kind of dive into a part of the shuttle world that I really didn't know that well. And also, as a child, I say this all the time, but, I gravitated away from space a bit, as a teenager, just because, when your parents do something, it's not necessarily always that cool. And I also didn't really, study the shuttle as much as I could have. It was kind of just one of those things where my parents would wake up at 3 in the morning to go, cover a launch and then come home, at midnight or something crazy like that. So it was really neat to dive into each of these shuttle flights that the women were on. And like I said earlier, learn more about the payloads and what the objectives were, and how much they had to train and what kind of training entailed to go to space. So it really did it was a beautiful full circle moment for me, as someone who grew up with this program but didn't really appreciate it at the time.
And are your parents still working at NASA?
No, they were happily retired and enjoying their pensions.
And especially for your mom, having a career like that, and you note a little bit in the book about not just the astronauts and how much how far we've come since the beginning of having women in these fields. But why do you think 45 years later we're still not there? In either operational or the engineering community or the astronauts? Well,
I think when you put societal barriers in place, they just take a very long time to dismantle. I think a great example is the choices that were made in the early days of the program. For instance, spacesuit sizes. There was an effort to create the extra small upper torso, which is part of the spacesuit, so that it could accommodate, smaller women. Well, it would predominantly be women, but smaller people in general. And that choice was not made ultimately. And so, years later, it takes so long to make those developments and to build those, that technology, that those choices that we make reverberate through time. And so obviously, if you remember, the first all-female spacewalk had to be rescheduled because of a problem with spacesuit sizing. Now, obviously, it didn't have to do with the fact that there was no extra small, but it just goes to show that those choices that we make, they will have repercussions for years and even decades. And so I think maybe that can speak to why it's taken so long. It's just when it comes to space, things take a really long time to develop. And so if you make choices that limit people early on in the days of the program, it's going to take a really long time to dismantle those. So that's why we need to put these things front and center, is because then we won't have these issues play out decades later.
Sure. I think that is an important point and a piece of it. And you unearthed a great quote from a technician about the spacesuits who says, we're not discriminating. This is just economics. And I had to look into the spacesuit designs, and we've done this to ourselves more than once. So yeah, it takes 10 to 20 years. It doesn't take 45, and we keep making the same mistakes. Frankly, I think men are making the decisions, and we get the extra large suits, and we don't get the smalls. And this has affected many women in the program who I've known over time. And we say they're unintended consequences, and hopefully we are working through that. To me, I do feel that there is a bias when you look at doctors and lawyers, law schools, medical schools, over 50% female. But engineering isn't one of those fields that is trending in that direction, as we've been talking about, and continue to try to unearth the reasons. I know NASA's making attempts with Artemis. You look at the Dragon missions, astronauts flying now. The first mission had 2 white men. We had a lot of time to make that selection. In all of our flights, I think NASA just had the first flight that had the same number of women as men on it, but one of the women was from an international astronaut program. So, and truthfully, we were flying a lot more back in your story with the 6. In 1985, flew 9 missions, and those are of 5 to 6 people. So today we're only flying twice a year with NASA crews, rotations of 4. So there aren't as many opportunities.
There aren't, but I will say, and this is something I kind of touched on very briefly at the end of the book, as more of these commercial companies come online and offer different ways to get into space, there are more opportunities to send a wider array of people going up. I don't know if those opportunities are necessarily being realized, but, look at Inspiration 4 mission. That was the first, well, it wasn't the first all-civilian, or it was the first all-civilian mission that SpaceX flew on a private vehicle. And, that allowed for, a very different group of people to go. There were 2 women on that flight, and, one of them was a professor, another was a childhood cancer survivor. And so, hopefully with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, they're offering new ways to get into space that we've never had before. And so hopefully that means that, we can offer rides to people who would never have gone to space otherwise. Obviously, there's still a bit of a barrier involved, and that's, your wallet. But like with Inspiration 4 and, one of the recent Virgin Galactic flights, there are charity raffles, there are, nice benefactors who will pay your way for you. It's just finding that right opportunity. And so hopefully we just continue to move in that direction as more companies come online. Now, I will say, obviously, with companies in any industry, it's, we're still dealing with the same issues of any tech industry, in terms of bias, representation, and sexual harassment. So, while they may offer these new opportunities, we also have to, continue to look behind the scenes and make sure that we're, operating with everyone in mind and being as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, it's a very unique time for people to be flying in space, whether you're willing to call them astronauts or not. I tend to.
I won't get into that debate.
Yes, but the benefactors, as you stated, have just, I feel, done a fantastic job. As the mission you mentioned, Inspiration 4 and Jared Isaacman, that was the first space crew that was 50% female. But in general, the millionaires who are able to buy seats from the billionaires have all been men, and it is due to I think, as you say, some of these benefactors have chosen to give away seats to a broader range of individuals that will trail off over time, I'm sure, and most of the seats will go to not only the people who are willing to pay, but the ones really interested. And there is an element to this that is poll after poll shows that more men are interested in going to space than women. Of course, that still means there's plenty of women willing to go. But there is something about it that is different. And I think these 6 really what I liked about them, and I don't know if it was part of the selection, but they did have a big range within them of their reasons and their interests, as you really point out. I am, though, interested, since I think as a government program, the NASA astronauts, that's where we can make the greatest impact. There was not a hint in the book, so I'm wondering if you ever uncovered it, of the women being in any way less capable or qualified, and when they were on their flights, whether their ability to do their job was in any way wanting.
Not that I really uncovered. I think, they definitely talked about their struggles. Some of them obviously struggled in certain areas of training before they flew, but they were really so determined to be as best as they could be that, I didn't really uncover anything from them that, doubted their selection or that they were worthy of the job in any way.
Yeah, it really comes out, in fact, that they all made incredible contributions on orbit in their missions. I think probably that's the case with any astronaut you write about. That NASA's been focused on that for all the right reasons. Mm-hmm. And as we wrap up, we've just got a couple minutes left. As we talk about beyond the six and NASA's ability to incorporate women in a lot of these decisions being made by men, in many ways that is still happening, although we recently had a woman who is head of the human spaceflight program. Mm-hmm. She left to go to SpaceX. We haven't yet had a female NASA administrator. I'm one of 4 female deputy administrators we've had. So still just wondering and you talk about this a little in the end of the book, what's ahead? I know we've talked about Artemis, but mm-hmm. do you see there's that change will continue?
Well, like I said, I think it might be a little controversial for some, the fact that the Artemis program has the stated goal of sending the first woman, the first person of color to the moon. But I do think that is a tactic that gets results. I think it's just look at the selection committee that picked the first 6 women. They had diversity and inclusion top of mind when they went to go select this class, and so that dictated how they advertised for the program. They hired Nichelle Nichols from Star Trek to come do a PSA to reach out to folks. It dictated, what universities they went to, what groups, what clubs they spoke with. And because they had that at top of mind, that really ultimately led to their success in finding women and people of color to come into the program. And so I think, that's a good lesson for why it's important to have these things, top of mind when you go out and you make those selections, because it ultimately leads you to making decisions that make that goal successful. So, it can be up for debate on whether or not it should be part of the Artemis program to have those stated goals, but I just ultimately think that it will lead to success. So maybe that's a lesson that NASA can take with it as it moves forward, is, when you put these things top of mind, you will find the right people for the job.
Well, I think that's a great message and a great wrap up for this book review, The Six, The Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts. Loren Grush, it's a beautiful story, and I really appreciate you telling it and talking to me about it today.
Thank you so much, Lori. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.